Hello, I'm Gwen Eichel. Welcome to the Washington Week webcast extra. I'm joined around the table by John Dickerson of Slate Magazine and CBS News. He's asking for a martini, actually. Matea Gold of the Washington Post. She looks more like a Manhattan guy. Pete Williams of NBC News. You're the Manhattan guy. And
I'll take either one.
Of ABC News will get you a gimlet, but we're not going to do that yet. A feud is brewing between the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Central Intelligence Agency, and it's about whether the agency told the truth about its interrogations and how the Senate is investigating it. How did this come to a boil this week?
It has been boiling. It's been boiling over, actually, but it's been underway for so long. But what the Senate Intelligence Committee did this week was vote 11-3, a pretty bipartisan vote. 3 Republicans voted no to declassify their report of the CIA interrogation program. So this is sort of not the final word on this post 9/11 interrogation program, but it is the culmination of years of investigations, and basically was what the United States did proper or not. And Senator Feinstein, when she was announcing this vote, really used very strong language. She said it exposes a brutality which stands in stark contrast to our values as a nation. It chronicles a stain on our history that must never be allowed to happen again. So what happens next? The president has said he wants this report to be declassified, but who declassifies it? The CIA. Oh. So it actually goes back to the CIA, and they decide. But there will, it's almost certain to be, this abbreviated version of this report, 6,200 pages, but an abbreviated version, some 400 pages, will likely be released. So it is going to show exactly if these methods were, in fact,
so like waterboarding
right,
and things.
Waterboarding. And things.
So the central understanding or our complaint is that the CIA misled Congress when they asked about these methods.
Right. That's what Senator Feinstein and others allege. They say there was gross mismanagement of these programs when the Senate and others went to look into this. The CIA purposely misled and covered up, and now there's a whole sort of side act going on between the Senate Intelligence Committee and the CIA. Both accusing the other of looking at their computers and other things. The Justice Department's involved. This is quite a messy thing, but we are getting closer to having sort of, another version of the history written of this very controversial program.
Actually knowing what actually happened. Matea, we talked during the regular program a lot about campaign finance, and I want to follow up on one interesting thing which you've written as much about as anybody. Last couple of weeks, we've seen that Senator Reid go a little bit bonkers over the Koch brothers and the idea that they were influencing Republican politics, but elections in general. First of all, what's the genesis of his complaint? And second, who are the Koch brothers to most lay people?
Yeah, it's amazing how much the role of big donors is becoming part of the political discourse now. It's actually a campaign talking point. But Charles and David Koch are conservative billionaires whose privately held company, owns, everything, brawny, paper towels, you name it, components that go into iPhones. They run the gamut. And we did an investigation with the Center for Responsive Politics to try to trace how they influence elections. These are not folks who are giving donations to super PACs or to campaign committees all the time that are disclosed. They're really putting their money into nonprofit groups that operate kind of outside the regulatory framework. And what we found was that they had created this incredibly sophisticated complex web of organizations that poured at least $400 million into the 2012 cycle.
Wow.
Fraction of that money was reported as actually election spending. Most of it was really under the radar. And they did this by setting up LLCs that really masked the group's relationships and how they were transferring money from one to another. And so they have become a real symbol for the Democrats of what's wrong with big money politics. And I think they're kind of being portrayed, obviously, in kind of a cartoony way by Reid as like the sinister folks behind the curtain pulling all the strings. And the Republicans are countering that Democrats have their own wealthy backers. And most recently, Tom Steyer, a former hedge fund manager who's now announced he's going to help pump $100 million into campaigns on behalf of pro-environment candidates this cycle. So there's plenty of money to go around.
Whose big money
exactly
it's coming from and going to, whether you think it's good or bad. Pete, I want to ask you about another interesting. It's a little bit leaked into foreign policy. The case of Jonathan Pollard. He was imprisoned. How many years ago now? It's been a while.
Roughly 30.
And he's been in prison for spying on the U.S., an American citizen spying on the U.S. on behalf of Israel.
Right.
This week, he became kind of a chit in the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. But I don't know at the end of the week where that stands.
Well, it's sort of on hold right now because the whole process is on hold. And the interesting thing about Pollard is that when he was sentenced to prison in 1986, he was arrested in 85, trying to go into the Israeli embassy. When he was sentenced in 86, we still had parole in the federal system. And under the law that existed then, he became eligible for, if you were sentenced to life, as he was, the first American ever sentenced to a life in prison sentence for spying for an ally.
Right.
The law said that you became eligible for parole after 10 years. So he became eligible for parole in 95, but he's never asked for it. Now, a second law is about to kick in that said if you are this is when he was sentenced, that if after 30 years you will be released unless the parole commission finds that you were a problem in prison, disregarded all the rules, or there's a likelihood that you will commit a crime when you're released.
So he's eligible for release next year, but the proposal was to perhaps move that up.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, if he was a bargaining chip in these negotiations to move the Middle East peace process along, he'd in essence be getting out of prison a year and a half early.
Interesting, but even that looks like it's falling apart a little bit on a whole different level. John Dickerson, you wrote this week about Jeb Bush's moment, as if he's having a moment. And I have to say, I remain skeptical about whether he is interested in coming back and running for president, or whether he agrees with his mother that we're about done with Bushes.
Well, the way it works in presidential politics, you can have a moment even if you don't want to have a moment. And the reason he's having his moment is because Chris Christie's having his own moment. So Chris Christie, ever since he got embroiled in this bridge scandal in January, when you talk to people who were backing Christie, either specifically or who would like to back him because they're from what we can call, for in a blunt way, sort of the establishment part of the party. They want to win. They want to have a governor. They're a little worried about the Tea Party. They tend to be what used to be called kind of country club Republicans. You'd have conversations with these same people, and they'd say, well, I'm a little worried about Christie and how another shoe might drop. And they start to feel, and then they would, about the 4 minutes in, they would say, you know, what about Jeb Bush? So that was kind of out there. Now, that's been true. That was true last cycle. Yeah. It's been true ever since he won his second term as governor of Florida. But what then happened is in the Washington Post, Robert Costa and Philip Rucker wrote a piece saying, hey, there's a draft movement, and got to some of these guys. And there's a little bit more of a focus now on possibly drafting him. And I've talked to people who've talked to him, and basically he's thinking about it.
Does anybody ever say they're not thinking about it as long as there are speeches to be given and paid for?
True enough, although in 2012 he said he wasn't thinking about it, and he then went out and said a bunch of things that proved he wasn't thinking about it. When he said he might be for tax increases if there were enough spending reductions, well, that's heresy at the moment. He also, just in terms of tallying up the hurdles for him, if we may, one, you know, these disclosures about torture, that's the legacy of the Bush years. And he would probably have to answer that more than anybody else. He's a very loyal fellow, and you could imagine him just getting tied down all day long in fights about his brother. Another is that not only does he have a different view, basically, of a really vocal part of his party on immigration, but also on Common Core educational standards. So on two policy issues that are hot-button issues, he's not on the wrong position. And then tax increases. I mean, he's in a fight with Grover Norquist. No Republican does that and lives to tell. So he would be a really exciting candidate because there would be a lot of internal warfare. But you know, there's always the question with him whether he really wants to go through it all, and that's still up in the air.
That should be the question for every presidential candidate that exists. Do you want to go through it all? That's my advice for you tonight. Thanks, everybody. We could go on, but we won't. But stay online at pbs.org/Washington Week to see more of what our panelists are reporting. It's good stuff. And we'll see you next time on the Washington Week Webcast Extra.